And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Greenville Post writes, the British Imperialist Disease lingers on. Don't get infected by the British disease. Pomp and circumstance was created to impress the hoi polloi. It has, of course, quote-unquote, democratic equivalents. What's the significance of this so-called coronation, and what does it really represent? For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. And he is, of course, Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back and congratulations on the release of the new book.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
So King Charles III has been officially crowned during his coronation inside Westminster Abbey. I think it's important, first of all, for people to understand what a coronation really is. It is a religious ceremony that projects the will of God, almost the divinity, upon the king. And your thoughts on what does this imperialist disease really mean?
Well, first of all, recall that it was in the 16th century, the 1530s to be particular, that the monarchy in London seceded from the Catholic Church, seceded from the Vatican. Now, ostensibly, that had something to do with Henry VIII wanting a divorce, the Catholics not wanting to grant it, but actually it led to a major land grab and property grab because the Catholics in the Vatican, in what is now Italy, controlled a good deal of the wealth of England. And so that set London onto this rapacious course, which helps to explain why there are so many Africans in North America speaking the language of London, speaking English, in other words. So when the English ousted the Catholics, rather than the Pope being the representative of, quote, God, unquote, on earth, the king, the monarch, became the representative of, quote, God, unquote, on earth. And this procession, this fable that you saw this past weekend was meant to throw dust in the eyes of the subjects of the British Crown to begin with. And also, it was a continuation of a moth-eaten tradition that should have been dispensed with centuries ago. And certainly, I think it's fair to say that this made-for-TV spectacle that was broadcast globally this past weekend will not deter Jamaica and Australia, for that matter, from ultimately seceding from the crown, because technically King Charles is now the head of state in Jamaica, believe it or not. And instead, I think it will reinvigorate the cry for reparations for Jamaicans and Barbados too, and others, for the centuries of enslavement and rape and plunder of Africans.
You know, and I think this is actually kind of connected. There's Pepe Escobar has a story, Divisions Brewing in Europe. You know, and of course one of the divisions being, and I'm seeing this more so than ever as I look online, a lot of people in England mentioning the economic struggle, saying, you know, we're spending all of this money for the king, and you know, people are having economic difficulties, and I think that sentiment is spreading throughout Europe, where people are looking at their circumstances. They're looking at the United States empire and they're saying, we're serving the empire, it's not working for us at all, and there's starting to be a movement in another direction. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly that's the case. Right now, there's a fundamental contradiction in the European Union, and that is that recent entrants into the EU, speaking of Poland in the first place, but its comrades on the Baltic Sea, speaking of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are basically pawns of Uncle Sam. And they're the ones who are pushing for more EU intervention in this failing escapade in Ukraine at the behest of Uncle Sam. At the same time, you see France and Germany, which ostensibly are the locomotive of the European Union, They're the ones who disproportionately pay the freight that allows Polish and Baltic leaders to get on their soapbox and complain. Well, they are sort of being led around by the nose by these Eastern Europeans and by the United States. I think that that's what led to President Macron of France in his recent trip to China, expressing displeasure with joining Cold War II against China. I think that that is also why the Chancellery in Berlin, speaking of Chancellor Scholz, is growing increasingly unpopular because of the fact that he's not able to break with this failing policy in Ukraine. And speaking of Britain, Britain, of course, can be grouped with Poland and the Baltics in terms of being hawkish, but recall that it withdrew from the European Union, and therefore its council can be safely ignored within the EU. But at the same time, the withdrawal of Britain, speaking of Brexit, did not necessarily, to put it mildly, improve the wage standards and the living standards of the British masses. And so, therefore, they have to be satisfied with bread and circuses. That is to say, they have to be satisfied with this made-for-TV spectacle involving putting a crown on the cockamamie head of this guy we call Charlie.
You know, I'm glad that you phrased it that way, because when I looked at a few pictures of him, and that's exactly what I thought about when I looked at his expressions, and I said, this really looks silly. And also, I was really disturbed by the number of African Americans that got caught up in this foolish spectacle and failing to recognize the racism, the modern day racism that the family is projecting and engaged in, as Harry couldn't come onto the balcony and he didn't even really attend, and his wife wasn't there because he married a black woman. And all of that, and with this sentence from Sputnik, as the Biden administration is pushing ahead with simultaneously confronting Russia and China, Washington's European allies are facing risks of losing not only cheap energy commodities, but a leading trade partner too. And it's important in that conversation to understand the number of European leaders that have gone to China and are continuing to go to China to meet with Xi Jinping, to sign trade and other types of economic deals. None of them are really talking militarism. They're talking trade.
Well, on your first point, should I be shocked? Certainly, I'm disappointed to hear that there are some Black Americans who get caught up in this made-for-TV extravaganza of the crowning of Charlie this past weekend. I mean, after all, Charlie is sitting on a throne that was built at the expense of Black Americans' ancestors, and we are now carrying the language that Charlie's ancestors helped to develop. Well, that's only technically true, because the so-called House of Windsor actually has roots in Germany, believe it or not.
Yes, it does. Talk about Queen Charlotte. I mean, we can go to a whole lot of ways on that subject.
We certainly can. And I think it's long past time for our Black American friends to wake up and catch up with what's going on in the world. I mean, I thought that the term Uncle Tom arose in the 19th century to describe a peculiar and particular specimen, but obviously Uncle Tom has been adapted and adopted for the 21st century. If we are to take to its logical or illogical conclusion this fantasy of being mesmerized by the crowning of King Charlie. But with regard to China, it's another example of why it's so foolish to get caught up in the meanderings of U.S. imperialism, because obviously what happened, to put China in the passing lane, is something that's happening today. That is to say that 50 years ago, President Nixon overdetermined Moscow and cut a deal with China, supposedly at the expense of the Soviet Union. But China got a sweet deal, massive direct foreign investment, that now has it in the passing lane. It's created this juggernaut. Washington is at wit's end as to what to do. Until recently, there had been no high-level discussions between officials in Beijing and Washington. I just understand today that the foreign minister and the secretary of state apparently had some sort of conversation or something along that level. but President Biden still sits by the telephone like a lovesick teenager waiting for a phone call that never arrives from President Xi Jinping. And so unless we are doomed to be cannon fodder in a war with China, I would urge and encourage those would-be Black American Uncle Toms to dispense with that nonsense and join the ranks of those who would prefer to survive.
There's an interesting article, former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. Now he's talking about, oh, we must be able to defend ourselves against China. But when you read what he says the EU needs to adopt a single military policy with strong cooperation between the armed forces of European countries. And he advocates for a 300,000 strong emergency corps. Basically, he's saying the same thing that Macron said, only he's using China. It sounds to me like, again, it's what Macron said. We need to get away from the United States. We need our own military. We need independence. Yeah, sure, China. That's good a reason as any. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I would urge our friends and comrades in Berlin to pay attention to what's happening in their neighborhood. Washington is arming not only Ukraine, but Poland. Poland has terrible relations with Germany right now. And it does not require a leap of imagination to somehow imagine that these weapons that are flooding into Warsaw could ultimately be turned against Berlin. This would not be the first time that we witnessed such a turnabout. And with regard to Mr. Berlusconi, he is destined to enter the great beyond. He's in hospital. He's sick. And apparently he's sick of mind as well, because on the one hand, he does recognize that that boat has left the port in terms of China being a major power. And it's beyond imagination to think that somehow the European Union can make a comeback, develop a military that could then challenge the People's Liberation Army. I think that he must have overdosed on his morphine dosage.
Dr. Horne, I tend to think that it's just a fraud, that he knows exactly what he's saying, that he's not. If you notice, Russia's next door. He's deliberately not saying Russia. I think it's just a ruse that he's really just saying, look, we need independence and we need an army and we need an excuse. So I'll use China for excuse. I don't really think that he really means. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you never know with Mr. Bunga Bunga. Speaking of Berlusconi, the clown prince, who was once a prime minister, started off as a cruise ship singer and apparently has not proceeded beyond that level of intellectualism. So I'm not sure if Mr. Berlusconi himself knows what he's talking about.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis. And we look forward to having you back.